to usher in the messianic age. They don't mind if it's brought on by nuclear age. They are so sure of their ability to outlive the utility of their bodies. But just remember that was the last thought in the brain of every suicide bomber and every hijack plane. Follow the guidebook for an afterlife. Which one do I try? Which one do I try?
Hello and welcome to the second episode of the Stay-at-Home Atheist podcast. My name is Jon and I am the Stay-at-Home Atheist.
And I'm Stacey. Apparently I'm supposed to say something clever here, but I really don't have anything. So how about we just go to the mission statement?
Okay, so maybe if you'd said something clever in the first episode, then we'd have a standard to build on. But no. So the mission of this podcast is to challenge antiquated views on family values, particularly those in line with religious and conservative perspectives, and to promote secular and forward-thinking alternatives. Before we get started, though, that song you were listening to in the intro is called Afterlife. It is by the incomparable Shelley Siegel, and you can check her out on ShelleySiegel.com or anywhere you can find music, really.
So why don't we just go ahead and get on to the news? What have we got this week?
So this week we really only have one actual news item we want to talk to you about, but it's going to take up a little bit of time, so bear with us. As most of you know, Justice Anthony Kennedy, who was nominated by President Reagan in 1987, announced his retirement effective July 31st. And a lot of people are really concerned over this, and I understand that. This gives Trump another nomination to the Supreme Court, which will obviously most likely shift the court even further to the right, which is a concern for anybody who worries about things like gay rights and abortion rights and women's rights in general.
In the environment?
Yeah, the environment. But, I think it is important to kind of remember who Justice Kennedy was as a Supreme Court judge and why he was considered a swing vote. A lot of his votes, in fact, a little bit of research I did shows that the majority of his votes were pretty conservative. He voted conservatively in areas like gun control and the environment, but he did vote liberally in areas like rights for combatant prisoners in Guantanamo Bay and also for gay rights, which is a positive. And so I guess the concern is that whoever we get in next may want to overturn some of those.
So I would like to focus a little bit of our time to talk about abortion. One of his early decisions regarding abortion was to uphold laws that required parental consent for abortion. This personally affected me. When I was 15, I got pregnant. I was 15, did not need to have a child. I quickly made a decision that I didn't want to have that child at that time. I'm very thankful to have had Planned Parenthood when I was 15. They helped me confirm my pregnancy. They helped me find solutions and helped to be the support I needed while going through this process. These were things I didn't discuss at home. I couldn't go home and tell my mother that I was pregnant. That would have been devastating news for her or for the rest of my family and would have made me an outcast. So it was an easy decision for me as to what I wanted to do. The execution was the hard part. So unfortunately, in Indiana, you couldn't get an abortion without parental consent. Again, I was 15, so I had to figure things out on my own. We decided to go to Michigan to have the abortion. I was lucky that I had a friend that had a driver's license and a car, and that my boyfriend at the time was willing to take on extra jobs to be able to afford the abortion because I wasn't working at the time. So it made it all very difficult for me trying to solve this problem without being able to talk to my parents. I've never regretted the decision, ever. I know it was the right choice for me. I wasn't ready to be a parent. I knew someday I wanted to be a parent. That wasn't the right time for me. And I carried this burden to this day. My parents still don't know. So guess we'll see if they listen to the podcast and figure it out. But it's really something that I think is important to talk about because I didn't want my children to have to carry this type of burden while they're growing up. It's not fair for a child to have to carry an adult's burden through life.
I think this segues really nicely into our key discussion topic for this week. We really want to talk a little bit about building an open relationship with your children and making sure that they know that they can come to you with these kinds of issues and not fear what you're going to do or say or the consequences of their choice to come to you. No kid should feel like they can't talk to their parents. So that's been something that we've spent a lot of time on as parents, is figuring out how to make sure that they know where we stand on these issues, and that even if it's a poor decision they've made, we'll support them even if we don't support the choice.
It's not always easy, but it's definitely been an important thing for us.
I think probably the best place to start is kind of a funny story about when our daughter Maddie was 11 and came out as an atheist. I remember, so Stacey and I don't think we were married at that time, but we had been living together for a while. And sorry, see, I don't know when we got married. Oops. But
okay, I always have to look at Facebook myself.
Right? That Facebook timelines thing, this is what happened a year ago today, has been a savior for that, right? So we were living in Raleigh, North Carolina, and our daughter was at school, and she came home from school, and it was just me home. And we had already kind of learned that the children were willing to tell me things early on that they weren't necessarily as ready to talk to their mother about, because I was kind of apart from the family in a way. And she came home and she asked me a funny question. She said, "So can you be Jewish and an atheist at the same time?" So I had to kind of explain to her about how Judaism isn't just a religion, it's also an entire culture. It's a people, which she understood, and that made her kind of realize that you could be both an atheist and a Jew. But then I asked her why she had that, like what sparked that question, you know? And she told me about a friend of hers who's Jewish, but who doesn't believe in God. I decided that was probably the right time for me to gauge her opinion on the matter, so I asked her how she felt about one of her friends not believing in the existence of a God. I was kind of surprised when she told me that she had thought a lot about it and didn't think she believed either. I remember she teared up and was really emotional about the whole thing. She was terrified to talk to her mother because she thought her mother would be angry with her, which is funny because at that time Stacey and I had been members of the Triangle Free Thought Society, and we're attending like weekly atheist meetups.
The kids just had no idea. They just thought we were going on a date.
Well, and I guess maybe we should sidebar a little bit to kind of explain why our children weren't aware at the time that we were atheists.
Yeah, so we are a split family, so the children's father still believes. And at the time, I hadn't really thought that it was proper for me to come out and say that I didn't believe, even though I was going through the process of leaving religion. We had decided when I was previously married to raise our children in a religious home. We raised them to believe. They went to church, they went to Sunday school, they did all that stuff. So, you know, I thought it was right. We thought it was right to try to teach them how to think, how to question, and let them come to it on their own accord instead of starting somewhat of a discussion with their father when maybe it wasn't the right time.
Yeah, and I'm glad you kind of corrected yourself when you said I decided instead of we decided. Because actually, if I remember correctly, and again, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but
I will.
I know you will. I seem to remember you were a little more keen on trying to have a discussion, and I was kind of like, look, I don't believe a God exists, but we don't want to start a fight, so we need to be careful about how we do it. And I think that's pretty typical, even though I don't think I was using the word atheist at the time. I hadn't really believed in a long time, so I was a little less like gung-ho at the moment, and Stacey was really kind of trying to jump in. Yeah. So we just decided that was something we weren't going to discuss. And honestly, I think that had some pretty interesting and sometimes negative effects on our family as a whole.
Absolutely. That makes me remember all of the struggles that Maddie had. She had nightmares for a long time. She struggled with hell and death and all of these things that she had been raised to know. And now how does she deal without having that? I mean, there were many nights where it took us hours to get her to go to bed because she was just devastated and distraught.
And I think it's important to point out that, you know, she's 17 now, actually very nearly 18, and these issues aren't as prevalent, but she still does sometimes struggle with the thought of hell. Or I think, though, it's more kind of morphed into the thought of not having heaven, the thought of not getting to see her
not
loved
having
ones.
anything else. This
Exactly.
being it. Yeah. And I think, that Sonny didn't go through that, right? So we raised Sonny in a very open questioning scenario. He didn't remember going to church. He doesn't remember going to church. And
Well, real quick, I think it's just important to point out that Sonny was 4 or 5. I guess he was 5 when she was 11. And she started asking these questions, and we then had to be open with her about exactly what it is we think. Not that we'd been dishonest, we'd just been careful to avoid the topic.
Right.
So Sonny would be underfoot. He was a 5-year-old.
Yeah.
He'd be there. He'd be sitting on the couch watching cartoons, and we'd be talking about whether or not there's a God and what kind of evidence you would need. So Sonny started picking up on these things very early on. So his experience being raised in a secular household is not the experience that his sister had. And I guess that's kind of the shame of it. But
yeah. Well, and, Sonny questioned Santa Claus and the Tooth Fairy and all that stuff much earlier. He figured it out. He didn't just question it. He figured it out very early. And Maddie believed till she was almost 10, I think. And so you can see the differences now between how they've adapted and how they process information, how they process situations, that they do it very differently. Maddie still struggles sometimes with understanding, does something make sense? And Sonny, not so much. He is much more open about trying to figure things out logically.
yeah, don't let her listen to this episode. But I mean, it is true. I think there's been studies done that show that children raised in predominantly religious households up to a certain age, and I think it's right around there. That I think the important ages are like 4 to 9 or something like that. I'm not quoting a study. I'm just sort of talking about it, but they tend to struggle to recognize the difference between fantasy and reality, because the things that they are being taught in a religious home are so strikingly similar to any other type of fantasy.
And having 2 children that were raised differently, it makes it a little bit more obvious for us to understand those impacts.
Well, and I think another thing that did, and this is sort of funny, but that actually caused trouble for Maddie in her daily life, because she remembered being raised in this religious type of environment, and all of a sudden she doesn't believe, and neither does her little brother. So she is very careful at the time about who she would tell. She still is pretty guarded about certain things. She's more open, but it's not. I tend to tell people very quickly that I don't believe what they believe, but Maddie is not quite like that. And so she would have, I remember one instance in particular, she had a sleepover, a bunch, yeah, you know where I'm going. She had a bunch of girls sleeping over. I don't remember if it was a birthday or just she wanted to have a thing.
We just always had the kids at our apartment.
There was always kids in the house. So she had, I don't know, 3 or 4, maybe 5 girls sleeping in her room. And one of them had been talking about, God or something. Sorry about that. I think the motorcycle just drove past my house. But one of them had been talking about God or something like that. And Maddie was just kind of nodding along. And Sonny, I guess he overheard it. He doesn't really remember it now. But he just walked in a room and said, there's no God. Maddie doesn't think a God exists. And just walked right back out. And she didn't know what to do.
She was devastated.
She was really upset. So, of course, then we had to have that discussion. Boundaries, Sonny. Like, it's not your right to tell her friends what she thinks. So that was an interesting problem that arose from our failing to teach Maddie certain things that we then taught Sonny.
Well, and it started the whole situation that we were concerned with around how to tell their father, because their father was remarried at that time and wanted them to go to church. And Maddie told her father that she didn't want to go to church because she believed in science and didn't believe in God. So then all of that just boiled to the surface, and we had to deal with that as well.
Which was interesting, to say the least. And I think kind of what all this boils down to is especially when you're a new atheist, even though I wasn't necessarily new to atheism, Stacey was, and I was new to being a parent. So we were kind of both new atheist parents at bare minimum. And I think the real problem, and this gets discussed on so many different atheist programs about how we need to have community and outreach. The problem is as someone who's just kind of come to a bunch of conclusions that everybody around you does not share, it's tough to know where to turn for help.
Yeah, it's tough to know who you can say things in front of and where you can go. And we were really lucky. We had the Triangle Free Thought Society where we were, so we were able to be in a community with other parents that weren't so new to atheism, and others that were. So we had that opportunity to be with like-minded people. And, we also leaned on a lot of books and material. There was one really good book that I appreciated having, which was Parenting Beyond Belief by Dale McGowan. And we relied on some information in there and tried to turn to wherever we could.
Unfortunately, when we moved away from Raleigh to the beach, we didn't lose that community because they're all still our friends and we're on Facebook or whatever, but we lost a lot of the physical community, going out to meet with people and discuss our views, bringing our children together to have other kids to play with who share those views. We lost a lot of that because if you listen to our first episode, and if you haven't, go back and listen to it. But if you listen to it, you know that we have a very, very conservative community here in Curry Beach, and that's been kind of a difficulty. So we've really leaned heavily on that online community. In fact, since we've left, we joined the Atheist Community of Austin as members and participate as volunteer. Well, I participate as a volunteer for them. And a lot of my friends now are people who I've either not met or have only met once when I was in Austin to visit the ACA. And so I just kind of want to encourage people to understand that we always say, I hear all the different shows talking about how, you're not the only atheist in your community. There's probably an organization there, and there probably is. But there are small communities the world over, really, where
it's hard.
While you're not going to be the only one, there may not be an organization for you. So start one, or at least in the interim, lean on this online community that I think has really been growing tremendously.
Well, and it's been a benefit to us not having a local community that we can rely on, because it is the hardest part about leaving religion is having a community of like-minded people. And, I think just kind of to end cap our discussion here, I wanted to share a story where all of this played out in the right way. So we started this conversation around trying to make it comfortable for our children to tell us whatever is going on in their life, whether it's something we agree with, support, or understand, and that we will still be supportive and understanding parents. So when Maddie was, I think, 11, 12, I woke up one morning to a text message from her. And that text message said, "Oh my gosh, I think that I am gay." So that was an interesting way to wake up. But the positive note was she didn't know how to start the conversation, but she started the conversation to tell us how she felt. And we were able to then open the conversation with her and let her know that we love her and support her and her decisions, and that we were glad she was willing to come talk to us. And that's really kind of been our continuing conversation with our children. And they know that no matter where they are, what they're doing, that we're there to support. If she ends up at a party and things go awry, we're here to come save her from that situation. Whether it's something we think she should be doing or not is really irrelevant, because we're here as her support and to help her learn from her experiences, not to punish her because of her choices.
Yeah, I think there's this interesting, I guess it's maybe even an adage at this point, that you shouldn't be friends with your children, right? And to an extent, I agree. Your relationship with your kids needs to be a parental one, at least when they're children. But at the same time, I think you need to treat your children like people, not like, I hate to say like kids, because you should let them be kids, but they need to understand that they are people capable of making decisions and that you are there to guide them. And so instead of saying, don't do drugs, don't drink alcohol until you're 21, don't go to parties, instead of doing all of that, we have said, we understand you're going to want to try new things and have new experiences. Please be open with us. And if you find yourself, like Stacey said, in a situation that has gone out of control, that you can let us know, and we are there to help you through it. And I think that's really, as odd as this sounds, and will definitely sound odd to theists, that's kind of what atheism has taught us. And I know atheism is just a response to a claim, so maybe it's more like, humanism, but that's kind of what being a secular family has done for us, is to make us understand that all these taboos are just things people do.
Yeah, and it shouldn't be scary, and it shouldn't be something you can't talk to someone about, because we talk to each other about those things, and our kids should have somebody that they can talk to about those things. And it's made life easier for them, and honestly easier for us. I would much rather know what my children are doing, where they are, and know that they're going to tell me the truth, than have to think that my child might lie to me about where they're going or what they're doing because I wouldn't agree with it.
I absolutely agree with that. And honestly, it's one of the most important lessons I think we've learned as parents. I think you have to make sure your children understand that they can come to you no matter what, whether you agree or disagree with their choices. Otherwise, you're just going to always be in the dark. I know my mother was often left in the dark.
Mine was too. So let's go ahead and move on to our discussion about atheism.
For this discussion about atheism, I thought I would talk about why the answer, I don't know, is often the best one you can give to a question. I have identified as an atheist for quite a long time, and even before I didn't use that label, I didn't believe a God existed. So I'm pretty used to talking to theists about what they believe and why I don't agree with them. So because of that experience, a lot of people will private message me on Facebook or call me on the phone if they, if they're friends in that way, and kind of ask me about how to deal with certain types of discussions that they are having. Or I often get people tagging me in Facebook chains or messaging me links to their chains so that I can come in and talk to the people they're discussing things with.
I even do that.
So what kind of happens is I find myself giving advice a lot. I don't always know if I should be the one giving that advice, but obviously I'm a little more accustomed to these conversations than they are. And the thing I think I get most often, and most recently from my twin sister, who's an atheist, is people asking me or telling me like, John, you've read the Bible, so you have a better handle on the material. I wish I could engage the way you do, but I just don't know about that stuff. And that's the thing, is you don't need to know anything about the Bible or the Quran or whatever other holy book in order to have a conversation about what you believe. And I think that's the most important lesson in skepticism and in, I'll call it debate, but obviously we're just talking about discussions and mostly online. Just be honest about what it is you believe and question why they believe the things that they believe. And I think the reason I love the answer I don't know so much is that it really frustrates theists, because kind of their whole thing is we know the answers to these important questions. So there's a question and a theist says, well, the answer is God. And then they love to turn to an atheist or someone who disagrees with them and say, well, then what's your answer? And it is tremendously frustrating for them, I find, when you say, I don't know, but I'd like to know, so I'm going to keep looking for those answers. I'm not going to insert this thing that has no real explanatory power. Appealing to God as the answer to a question is appealing to a bigger mystery to answer your mystery, or something along those lines. And I think that's absolutely true. If you're willing to just insert an all-powerful deity as the answer to all of your questions, then you have cut yourself off from answering the questions with, I don't know, science. And that's a lesson I've really tried very hard to instill into our children. I say I, but we've tried. Yeah. My daughter still messages me from time to time, and it's not always about religion, but she'll just ask me like, someone brought this thing up, I don't know about it, can you help me? And that's great, and I don't mind helping her, but I always kind of try to tell her, like, look, if you don't know the nuances of this discussion, getting a 2-page text for me is not going to do that for you. Don't look to me for answers to questions you are asked. You need to research those questions, particularly these important types of questions, and have answers for yourself. If there is nothing else my children take away from all of these lessons that I have tried to instill in them, I want them to take away the fact that it is absolutely acceptable to respond to a question with I don't know. Anybody who asserts that they have an answer when they don't is being dishonest. So I guess that's it for this week's discussion about atheism. If you didn't already agree with me, well, I hope I gave you something to think about.
All right, so it's that time again to ask you to send in your thoughts and plug our listener mail. We'd love to hear from you guys, hear your questions, thoughts, comments. So send us an email at Jon, that's Jon, at stayathomeatheist.com, or you can find us on Facebook and Twitter by searching the Stay at Home Atheist. And don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to our YouTube.
Oh yeah, and don't forget to ring that little bell next to subscribe if you'd like to see our notifications. Bertrand Russell once said, "The good life is one inspired by love and guided by knowledge."
Until next time.
Thousands and thousands are humming, the second coming's coming. The environmental responsibility is succumbing to the suicidal longing for paradise. Can't they see it's already before our eyes? All that makes us who we are, we find cannot survive without our mind. But you're so afraid to die, you're willing to sacrifice.